Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Britanski investitor i lobista rođen u SAD-u već je 1996. godine počeo investirati u Rusiji. Nakon ubistva njegovog advokata Sergeja Magnickog, lobirao je za donošenje globalnog zakona poznatog kao Magnicki akt, kojim se uvode sankcije ruskim zvaničnicima. Sebe naziva neprijateljem broj 1 ruskog predsjednika Vladimira Putina i godinama se zalaže za zamrzavanje ruske imovine na zapadu. Gost emisije Recite Al Jazeeri je Sir Browder. Sir Bill Browder, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, when I first interviewed you just a few weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, I remember you being rather firm and confident in your predictions about Vladimir Putin's ambitions in Ukraine. At the same time, I interviewed a few former US generals and a former US admiral, and they thought Putin wouldn't be so reckless as to go to war with Ukraine. Now, as we enter the third year of Russia's assault on Ukraine, how united is the West when it comes to defending Ukraine? How united is the West in perceiving Russia as a common threat?
Well, the West is a lot more united than it was on February 21st, 2022, the day before the invasion. I think, as you mentioned, there were a lot of people that didn't believe it was going to happen. If you remember, Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz visited Putin 2 weeks before the war started, and he assured them there's absolutely no chance that there's a war. And of course, he lied to their face, and so a lot of people who had historically been great sort of appeasers and compromisers with Putin all got very big backbones, grew them very quickly. And so for a long time, we've had a pretty solid alliance. But what we have going on right now is that as time goes on, the war is very expensive, costing a lot of people a lot of money. And at the same time, you have a change in the politics of different countries. And so, for example, we've had these European elections in which Marine Le Pen's party seems to be dominating France, and the AfD is dominating Germany. Both parties are much more sympathetic to Putin than they are to Zelensky. And so I think we're sort of, slow sleepwalking, I would say, potentially into a much more dangerous situation where if the West stops supplying weapons to Ukraine, which is a possibility if Trump gets elected, if Marine Le Pen starts dominating Europe, et cetera, where Putin could end up getting the upper hand. Mm-hmm. And if that were to happen, then all of a sudden Putin wins in Ukraine and then moves further west. And if he moves further west, then we have a much bigger problem all over the world. And we'll be very united then, but it'll be a much more expensive and much more bloody problem for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll be speaking more about Le Pen and AfD later on in the interview. But before that, I wanted to ask you, because you have been dealing a lot with sanctions and how effective they were on Russia. So, 3 years on, what have sanctions achieved since the war in Ukraine began, if we know that critically needed technologies are still flowing into the Russian arms makers via third countries, if you know that Russian oil and gas is still sold around the world through a shadow fleet of dozens, if not hundreds of tankers, some of them owned by Greek oligarchs, and if you know that Russian crude oil is being refined in China, in India, and then resold to the European Union.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. Those are the big loopholes in the sanctions program. But let me just back up for a second. Mm-hmm. The sanctions are devastating for Russia. The $300 billion of Russian money is frozen in Western central banks, and that money will probably be confiscated. Probably a similar amount of money that belongs to the oligarchs has been frozen. All of Russian industry and government and companies no longer have access to the Western capital markets. Thousands of Western companies have pulled out. 1 million Russian able-bodied young men have left the country. it's a disaster. I mean, there's no way to spin it any other way than that. But as you pointed out, those are the three big loopholes. The like ball bearings, for military use were forbidden for export to Russia, but then all of a sudden the numbers get to Kyrgyzstan go up 1,000%,
Exactly.
Armenia, et cetera. And that, of course, that's got to stop. And the same thing as you mentioned about the Russia sells its oil to Chinese, Indian, and Turkish refineries, and then they sell the refined product back to us, and we say, we don't seem to notice. But just the fact that you're talking about this, and the fact that I'm talking about this, who else is talking about this? The United States Treasury is talking about this.
Right,
The British Foreign Office is talking about it. The European Union is talking about it. And so whatever tricks the Russians have for evading sanctions, we're trying to figure out how to stop those things. And it's a dynamic process. These departments in the Treasury and in the Foreign Office and other places, they only got staffed up 2 years ago. They're learning on the job, and there's not a lot of people doing it, and they're staffing them up further, and they're coming to people like me and many others saying, what do we do to stop all this nasty stuff from happening? And so they will do stuff to stop it from happening, and the Russians will come up with other ways of evading sanctions, and step by step, the process will become harder and harder for the Russians. Now, the question is, do we get there before or after the Russians have already infected the political consciousness of the West in all these elections, where you have, as we mentioned, a bunch of people sympathizing with Putin on the cards to be running some of these countries.
You talked about the Treasury Secretary, and we know that the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said a couple of weeks ago that the use of frozen Russian assets for aiding Ukraine is not theft, despite Vladimir Putin claiming otherwise. She also added that there are no legal issues with giving Ukraine a large loan backed by Russian assets. Now, can you explain to me and to our viewers how exactly is this supposed to work in practice?
Well, so at the beginning of the war, the West did something very dramatic, which was Russia had kept a lot of their money, their central bank reserves, state money, in the deposit of the Federal Reserve of the United States, and the Bank of England, the European Central Bank. In total, that amounted to about $300 billion, perhaps a little bit more.
Right.
That money was frozen. And so the money was frozen, and as time has gone on, and as the bills have racked up, we're starting to say to ourselves, well, maybe some of that money, or all of that money, in my opinion, should be used to help Ukraine defend itself. Why shouldn't Putin pay for Ukraine to defend themselves before we do? And that idea has now gotten traction. In the U.S. Congress, there was a piece of legislation passed about a month and a half ago called the Repo Act. And that creates the legal basis for the United States to seize all the money, all the Russian central bank reserves held in the United States. Lord David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, has been publicly stating that it's his position that the money at the British Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Russian money should be confiscated. The one big holdout is the European Union. The European Union is a country, or a block of countries where there's a few big pro-Russian sympathizers in this whole bloc, in particular Viktor Orban. And so it's very difficult for the European Union to take the decision, and they have the most money. And the one thing I can say is that one country can't seize the money by itself. It has to be done together. Because if one country does it, let's say the United States does it, then people will say, well, maybe the US dollar is not a safe currency, but the euro is, because look, they didn't confiscate that money. And so we all have to do it together, and we're sort of stuck with the lowest common denominator. So what happened here is that some fudge was created, a total sort of internal compromise decision was created, where we said, well, we can't seize the money, but for some reason we've decided it's okay to seize the profits on that money. And so that was the decision that Janet Yellen was talking about. And so they've taken it one step further and kind of come up with a very complicated scheme where they're saying, we're going to take the profits into the future, and we're going to issue a bond today of 50 billion, and that those profits can be used to secure that bond. And that's their sort of current thinking. In my opinion, it's all a big convolution, and we should take the whole 300 billion. I think we'll get there in the end, but that's where we are today.
Right, but I mean, do you think, why are some Western leaders sort of unsure about taking Vladimir Putin's cash reserves in European capitals?
Well, because Putin has been spreading around these rumors saying that if that happens, then all hell is going to break loose and nuclear war and all sorts of other nonsense. And there's a lot of people that are just sort of trembling every time he threatens something. And that's what he does. That's what a thug does. That's what a mafia boss does, is he makes threats.
Well, isn't that the exact reaction he's expecting from Europeans?
Exactly. Well, he wants that reaction. And for all those Europeans that are trying to appease him, they should understand that by showing him weakness, he gets more aggressive. So if you want Putin to be really doing nasty stuff, show you're weak. If you want Putin to stop doing nasty stuff, put a boot on his throat.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sir Bill, I wanted to ask you, how do you make sense of the fact that large U.S. companies such as Halliburton have been operating in Russia up until September 2023, or Schlumberger, which now changed its name to SLB? Actually, its businesses in Russia grew, since Russia invaded, Ukraine, because they picked up on opportunities as other companies left behind.
Well, we can say there's a lot of very greedy people in those companies that seem to value money more than security for the world. And I think that we need to figure out sort of if they're not willing to leave Russia on their own volition, then there should be some kind of policy to force them out of Russia. One of the things I've been talking about is there should be some type of windfall profit tax on companies for all profits that they derive from Russia. If a company has derived profits from Russia, that should be taxed away at 100%. And so that would create a very strong incentive for them to stop doing it, because they don't get any benefit from it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now let's go back to the European elections and the rise of the far right in Europe. So we know that in the recent elections, the AfD and Le Pen's party have made huge wins across the continent. Do you see Russian fingerprints in the EU political landscape today, in pushing forward the far right political parties, and sort of creating divisions, internal divisions and cleavages within the European Union?
Yeah, we see it every day on Twitter. I'm a big Twitter user, and if you look at all the things being tweeted and reactions to those things, there's a whole St. Petersburg troll factory up and running and doing really hard work to try to create dissent, to fume anger, and to plant ideas that are contrary to what's in the Western national interest. And that's very helpful to the people who are saying these things themselves. And for what it's worth, Marine Le Pen's party, the National Front, they borrowed money from a Czech bank that was owned by a Russian, and so a Kremlin-connected Russian. Mm-hmm. And so it's clear that they have a sympathy towards Russia.
Right. Now, a large part of your work is, trying to free political prisoners who have been thrown behind bars by Vladimir Putin's regime, one such being Vladimir Kara-Murza. Now, he was arrested soon after attending a meeting in Belgrade with the other Russian opposition leaders a couple of years ago, a meeting which was wiretapped by the Serbian intelligence and passed on by then chief of Serbian intelligence, Alexander Vulin, to his counterpart, Nikolai Patrushev. Now, do you see countries such as Serbia or Hungary as being, the willing enablers of Putin's long hand in Europe?
Well, there's no question. I mean, in both these examples, they're unashamed, not just enablers, I would say Russian allies in Europe. I mean, Serbia is a less concerning story because at least it's not a member of the European Union.
Right, but Hungary is.
But Hungary is. And you have Viktor Orban, who's openly siding with Putin and vetoing all sorts of EU policy, which requires unanimity to go forward. And he's they're vetoing the policy in order to help Russia. That's a huge problem. And, and that's the obvious stuff. And then there's a whole bunch of, more secretive stuff going on that the Russians are doing. And the Russians laugh at us. We have open societies, and then they take advantage of these open societies to do all this very malicious stuff, which helps their interests and harms ours.
Mm-hmm. Now, over the past 2 years, there has been a dramatic shift in threat perception among European states over the
a dramatic change in defense spending, a dramatic change in arms manufacturing. Has this war really woken up NATO member states from a very, very long slumber?
Well, I mean, they're starting to wake up. It's kind of like in the morning when you're just yawning and stretching. There's a lot more waking up that needs to be done. If you look at the amount of ammunition that we can produce in the West, we don't produce enough for Ukraine, let alone ourselves, if there was ever a major conflict. We had this thing called the peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. We had a peace dividend. We all really, and it was wonderful. We had all this extra money that we didn't have to spend on fighting the Soviets, and the economies grew, and everyone was happy and enjoying life and relaxing, and for the first time in decades. And we really got used to that peace dividend, and we got. The analogy I use is like we've gotten flabby, we've gotten out of shape, we've gotten weak, and the bad guys they're pumping iron, and so our leaders are going to have to wake up to the fact that we have dangerous enemies right on our doorstep that want to ruin our lives, that want to change our way of life.
Right,
and,
but in this case, do you agree with General Cavoli, who heads the U.S. European Command and is also the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, that regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends, Russia would still remain an enduring threat to NATO and to global security?
It's absolutely 100%. I mean, and all you have to do is watch like 10 minutes of Russian state television. You can hear the whole anger and what their view towards the West. As we speak, Vladimir Putin is in North Korea. North Korea, the hermit state, the most compromised country in the world because of all the crazy, nasty stuff they do. He's there declaring sort of full cooperation, alliance, and friendship with North Korea. And what that means is that it was a term used many years ago, the axis of evil, and we really have one now. We have China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran all working together against the interests of the safe, peaceful, democratic, free world. And that's a very worrying thing.
Right. A couple of economic analysts have claimed that China, India, some Central Asian states can make up for Russia's loss of the European and the U.S. market. You, as an investor, a former investor, is this something you agree with? I mean, can these countries really, do they have the potential to make up for all these huge Russian losses in the West?
Absolutely not. Under no circumstances can they make up for that. Russia has lost, first of all, one of Russia's main exports was gas, natural gas. It takes decades to build the pipeline network and they stopped exporting it to Europe. Now they try to export it to China. It's going to take decades to build that. Sure, they can buy a few Chinese cars instead of European cars and Chinese cell phones instead of stuff coming from Apple. But for the most part, there's no way that that's going to be made up. And the only thing that Russia can do right now is sell oil and then get that money and spend it on defense. I wouldn't even call it defense, on offense. That's all they can do. And that's what's keeping the economy afloat right now. They can't borrow any money from anywhere. And there's no other businesses that are generating any kind of economic return.
And finally, as we draw to a close, we know that historically Russia has been able to wage long wars. It has both the domestic resources and the necessary cannon fodder to absorb significant human losses, without justifying itself to its own public. Do you envision a long war between Russia and Ukraine?
I do completely. That's my prediction, is that this war is not going to end anytime soon, and that it's going to go on and on and on and on. And when we have to brace ourselves for it, and we have to figure out how we can create the resources so that Ukraine doesn't lose, because if they lose, we're next.
And what if President Donald Trump wins U.S. elections? Will he cozy up to President Vladimir Putin?
Well, that's been his history so far. I don't see any reason why that would change going forward. And what that means is that if he cozies up to Putin and he cuts off Russia, then Europe is going to have to double down. And thank God Europe has $200 billion of Russian money sitting in the European Central Bank, because that money is going to have to be used eventually to help Ukraine carry on fighting this war if the U.S. steps away.
All right, Sir Bill Browder, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you.
We ask the question.
What is needed in the world